Hello, it's Steve. I'm making this video as punishment for being 2 days late on my last upload, and probably an hour or two late on my current upload. Today we're doing an AI topic. In effort to avoid getting into the weeds about my take on LLMs, I'll just say it's mixed at best for now and try to leave it at that. Today we're going to be using a local language model running in LM Studio to brainstorm a game idea. Depending on who you are, this may sound like a terrible idea or a great idea or just strange. But let me use a metaphor here. Hallucination. This term is used a lot in AI circles, either for logical or factual errors in language model output, or just as accurately to describe actually everything a language model outputs. In any case, it's usually used with a negative connotation. But my take on that is if we're looking for an AI to know anything, we're just using a hammer as a saw. No, to best make use of language models, we want to use this hallucination to our advantage. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, I'm no anthropologist, so I could be completely off base here, but as far as I'm aware, hallucination has been used at many points in human history for various things. It's a way of looking into the tangled mess that is a human brain in new light. And that's what I think makes language model hallucination a good brainstorming tool. Or anyway, it seems to work quite well with game ideas for me. It helps me solidify my concepts a little more before writing any code. Left to my own devices, I'm definitely a do first, plan later sort of person. So it forces me to flesh out parts of my ideas I may not have engaged with until the actual implementation before. Some examples here. Sure, there are stats in your RPG, but what actually do they do? What are they? Why are you using those ones instead of some other ones? Another example, an item goes into your inventory, huh? Is it listed or is it in a grid? Do items have weight? Do they have icons or just names? Things like that. And this all leads me to a little less code refactoring, although definitely never none, and helps me get a better idea of the scope of my ideas before actually starting on a project. It's easy to think about an inventory in your brain, but actually thinking about how items are listed, how do you reorder them, how do you use a consumable item or equip an equipable item, it can really inflate the scope if you don't think too much about it. And I'm really good at not thinking too much about it. So there's our goals. Let's get started with the prompt. So this is a metaprompt I've used before. In my experience, it works pretty well. Full disclosure, it was vibe coded. I'm not even reading this right now. I just throw it in and hope that it generates me the Q&A session I'm looking for. So let's give it a shot. We'll do a strategy RPG. I think that's pretty likely to be my next project anyway. I could just send it here, but I want to have a somewhat unique concept to start with. Let's do tanks. I like playing games with tanks. I'm not going to describe this concept from the start. We'll leave it at this for now. And the guy starts going and is very complimentary, which makes me barf a little in my mouth. Yet, and you will be asked the dumbest questions. Dumb questions can sometimes still lead to interesting thought processes. The player is playing the sprite. All right, this is a pretty solid, thought-provoking question. Like, I had a concept of an SRPG, so for me that means moving units, battling with your units. In the case of our weird tank-based nanomachine strategy RPG, probably also moving the player and taking over tanks, I suppose. For now, I don't want to get too wild with it, so I think the player will also be a unit just like a normal tank, and will be able to move up to enemy tanks to take them over, basically. So that's what I'm going with. I don't remember, is it Advance Wars or Advanced Wars? Advance Wars. Okay. So I said the primary action verb will be command. The sprite is a normal unit along with other player-controlled tanks. I didn't specify earlier, but the game will be sprite-based, grid-based, 2D, with sprites inspired by Fire Emblem and Advance Wars. The language model doesn't necessarily need to know what the sprites are inspired by, but hopefully that gives a hint as far as the style of the game that will help us get some more questions. Alright, so now it's asking, what does taking over a tank mean in gameplay? For example, does the sprite infect the tank, convert it into a unit under its control, or do something else? And how does that affect the tank's behavior? Now that actually raises an interesting question. The easy answer here is just to say, what I clearly intended probably for everyone, including myself, is that it takes the unit under its control, right? And this is something I've had rattling around in my mind before, but I hadn't really solidified it as a core question of the game, is what happens to the player sprite after it takes over the tank. I think it needs to stay on the battlefield because then it can go and take over more tanks, and that's part of the fun of the strategy, kind of a collecting sort of aspect of each battle, and a flow of distinguishable early game intermission where you're collecting your tanks and kind of sneaking around the enemies, and then a midpoint where you're fighting off enemies and maybe sneaking up to grab more, and then a late game where maybe the sprite doesn't even have to move at all because you have plenty of tanks to take over the rest of the map. The easy answer would just be to say the sprite converts enemy units or tanks to its team. I think giving the sprite more than just that one capability would make a whole lot of sense, give it something to do when it can't be, actively taking over a tank. I went with, not only does the sprite convert enemy tanks, there's also could be mission-specific objectives only the sprite can achieve, and the sprite can also attach itself to a friendly tank in order to enhance its capabilities in some way, just to give that unit something else to do other than run around and capture tanks. This one's pretty straightforward. Solo, and then missions should take around 20 minutes. It's honestly a pointless question to me, but we'll see what it gives us next. This is asking about win conditions for missions. Alright, I went with, the game will progress in a linear story, mission by mission. As the story progresses, new sprite abilities will be unlocked, and new types of tanks will be encountered. When going through this process, your language model is going to end up giving you what looks like a summary page. This is fine, especially this one, this is fairly short. I've seen basically the language model completely forget that it's trying to do a question and answer and just poop out a game design document and call it a day. That's not the best experience. Obviously, I want to end this whenever I feel the brainstorming session is completed. There are plenty of open-ended things here still, but I could easily continue this and give some more context and let it go from there. This actually really honestly reads more like a checkpoint, but I'm sure you could see how you could continue down this road until you feel you have it so fleshed out that answering any more questions seems completely pointless and arbitrary. That's how you can kind of decide when it's time to stop with the ideating for now and just build out a prototype, right? Or, look at your concept and decide whether or not you're even inspired by it at all. Maybe start this whole session over again, right? So when I first came up with a seed for this idea, there were some assumptions I was making in my head. SRPG to me means Fire Emblem or Advance Wars or what's the cool one? Wargroove. I was thinking about basically something along the lines of Wargroove, but I didn't really put that into my concepts directly. But there are also things that I just didn't even conceive of, such as making a decision whether or not the player actually is a unit on the field or is controlling tanks possibly through some external way. Say you click on an enemy tank and you just hit a button to control, for instance. Maybe you have a certain level of mana that you can use, and then anywhere on the map, if you see an enemy tank, you can click it and take it over, as long as you have enough mana to do so. Something like that, right? There's all sorts of different ways that this could have gone, and none of those were captured in the core concept that I started with. So hopefully you can see how this is kind of handy. Now, caveat time. Caveat the first. A human would probably do a much better job at this than a language model, but you'd have to convince someone to get on board to hear out your game idea and ask intriguing questions, but not to inject too much of their own input. It's okay kind of through here to completely discard a language model's output. I don't care about whether or not the AI understands how that attached mechanic works, right? But of course, it's not a bad thing to have that human input in terms of taste and feedback, but that's not really the point of this particular exercise. Caveat the second. Language models will generally just reflect their own training data, which will on average result in a game idea regressing to the mean, becoming very basic and normal. The upside of that is that you can really engage your brain to kind of keep those unique ideas and mechanics from being misunderstood. And caveat the third, you could just set up a list of questions and journaling and do this yourself. That requires a bit more discipline. There are definitely, resources on the internet to get you started with that. But in my opinion, that yields a little less of the hallucinatory magic that spitting up a language model grants. Anyway, like I said earlier, I have at best a mixed opinion on using language models in development, or in this case design, especially game development and design. I have experimented with a few ways of using them to see what fits my workflow. Stuff like feature card generation, which I absolutely despised. Documentation, which I haven't found a great use for yet, but I'm sure someone has. I've even used them for code generation. I do actually vibe code some apps personally now. I find the perfect use case for those sort of projects to be boring projects that I can imagine a solution to, but don't really want to code myself. Those are things like budgeting apps, to-do apps, whatever thing that you don't actually care about the implementation of because it's really, honestly, a solved problem. But maybe it's a solved problem you don't want to pay someone else for, right? This usage has just been by far the most successful I've messed with, especially when it comes to game development. I find it does a good job of taking me from the seed of an idea to having it fleshed out enough that I know, yes, I really want to work on this right now, or no, this project seems awful, either out of scope or boring or just plainly unfun. So, give it a shot or don't. LM Studio's pretty straightforward to use. If you wanted to do it locally, try it locally first. If you're a game person and have a decent computer, you can probably run some of these models locally. Some of them are way too big for my machine. I think I used Quen 3 here. I don't know. I'm not an AI guy. I don't know the models. I just know that Quen Next was a little bit too chunky for my computer, and I definitely tried some other models that were big enough to not even be able to launch. Anyway, I have rambled for long enough. Later.